Elder, what's the matter?
A voice called out from the quiet tavern. Suddenly, the room was a flurry of motion and noise as patrons jostled for a view of the fur-wearing man or tried to ask him a question. The curly-haired boy spoke up.
Hey, mister, what are you doing outside at this time of night?
He called out over the din. The noise abruptly quieted as the fur-covered man's hood swiveled towards the boy, and piercing blue eyes peered out at him.
Bandits, in the woods. I found their encampment. They have the Baron's son held up there too. I saw them drag him out of a tent,
the man said. The girl frowned at this and spoke up.
Why were you looking for the bandits?
She asked. The man turned to her and growled, in a voice oddly reminiscent of the demon's voice.
I'm a bounty hunter, little girl. I was hired by the king to track down the bandits, not fight a small encampment. There are dozens of people there.
The scrawny kid looked skeptical. Is this a plot hook? He asked into thin air. Every head in the bar, including the fur-wearing man's, nodded in union. The kid shrugged. Hey, the classics are never bad, and began to stand up from the table. The room groaned. The people sitting around the kid sighed softly and dissolved into black fog. As the room melted away into smoke, it all swept towards where the kids were sitting, then hesitated at the base of the table. With a sudden surge, the fog pounced onto the top of the table and spread quick tendrils across its surface. The hanging globes of scarlet fire winked once again, then withdrew far, far into the ceiling until they were twinkling dots in a night sky that materialized above them. The kids sat in a densely wooded forest, towering over the trees as if they were giants. In the distance, jagged mountain peaks loomed tall over the grass. The girl reached out and brushed a patch of evergreens, startling a group of jet-black ravens into the sky. They wheeled around the group before dissolving into the night. The tabletop writhed with smoke that seeped into the wood grain, spreading an inky blot across the surface. Tiny splinters of wood erupted from the grain and stretched upwards, sprouting minuscule green needles and leaves. Snow began swirling around the kids, layering the treetops below and the surface of the table. Before 10 seconds had passed from sitting in the tavern, the table was a miniature of a snowy clearing, rising with the kids above the pine forest, stretching to distant mountains. The curly-haired boy grinned openly. Okay, that was cool. The girl leaned forward and spoke into the blizzard of snow whipping around them.
So, where are we now?
Unaffected by the wind and cold that only brought a light chill. The mountains around them suddenly rumbled and cracked, the faces crumbling and caving into deep voids, looking like stilted volcanoes or perhaps cowls of cloaks. Then the rock began sloughing away as the mountains stood. A ring of hooded figures rose from where the mountains had loomed, rock crumbling off their forms, and they walked forward to stand behind the kids. The bottoms of their robes faded into dark fog that twined with the miniature trees. Scarlet eyes bloomed within all the cows, identical and intense.
The fur-covered man leads the three of you deeper into the forest,
the growling voice of the demon said. One of the cowled figures stretched out an arm, and a skeletal hand of black onyx poked out of the sleeve. A single finger hovered above the forest clearing for a moment, as a droplet of ink formed at its tip. The droplet quivered, then spattered onto the snowy ground, twisting and gathering the snow into a pale figure. A man, wearing furs and a massive broadsword. 3 more droplets of inky darkness, and the snow formed into a tall elven man hefting a solid hammer, a human with an intricately carved staff, and a woman strapped with countless knives and ropes. They walked through the clearing, and the forest moved with them, forming in front out of smoke and dissolving once they had passed. All 3 kids leaned over the miniature in glee. "I asked the man his name," said the scrawny kid, his miniature's mouth opening and mimicked his words.
Julder,
the man's voice echoed through the night. He didn't say anything else, as if content to walk in silence. The girl turned to the curly-haired boy.
So, why do you think the bandits are attacking the town?
The boy shrugged. He turned to look down at Jolder, and his miniature walked forward to stand beside him.
How far away was the encampment?
Jolder shook his head.
Not far. We're getting close.
He turned and looked stonily at the elven, curly-haired figure.
I still claim half the reward, as is fair. I found them.
The curly-haired boy began protesting, but the scrawny kid shushed him at a noise. A twig snapped in the forest, then the snow froze motionless in the air, and the demon's voice sounded out.
I'm not sure how to do this,
it rumbled. The girl smiled lightly and said,
Are we about to get into a fight?
One of the hooded figures looming behind them inclined its head slightly. The girl gestured slightly.
We have to roll perception then, to see if we spot the enemies coming, with a 20-sided die.
The scrawny kid pulled a simple white die from a pocket and tossed it into the clearing. It puffed lightly in the snow, but still rolled unhindered. A 16. The girl tossed her die. A 14. The curly-haired boy dropped his intricately carved wooden dice into the clearing, and a 19 peered up at him. The hooded figures watched this intently, then turned their scarlet gaze on the small Jolder. The figure grew transparent for a moment, and an ebony die materialized inside and dropped to the ground. A 2. The demon's voice cried out in glee.
A 2 is the second highest I can roll, correct?
The scrawny boy coughed and slightly shook his head. No, 20 is the highest, 1 is the lowest, so 2 is pretty bad. An audible scowl echoed over the forest as Jolder hardened back into a solid figure and was promptly shot by an arrow. The man fell screaming to one knee, pulling free his massive broadsword. The human gripped his staff slightly and stepped lightly out of the path of the arrow that whistled by him. The rogue girl pulled free a pair of daggers and lowered into the bush, seeming to disappear amidst the snowy branches. The elven, curly-haired boy shouted a cry and hefted his hammer. 2 hooded figures outstretched their hands, and inkly droplets formed at the fingertips before dropping out of sight behind the trees, ringing the clearing. 7 droplets total. A moment later, 5 bandits burst into the clearing, accompanied by 2 smoky grey wolves. The curly-haired boy cried out, "I charged them!" And the elven man began running towards the nearest bandits, hammer raised dangerously. The scrawny boy spoke up. "I cast magic missile at the wolves." An intensely bright crimson flash erupted from the sorcerer, and a bolt of red lightning streaked across the clearing to strike the wolves, splitting in 2. Before it hit, the wolves faded and tiny dice rolled inside it before the wolves became opaque again and were hit by the brunt of the attack. They both fell to the ground, whimpering and smoking slightly.
I sneak around behind them to try and sneak attack them, said the girl. A faint rustle of brush could be seen making its way along the edge of the clearing. One of the bandits grew transparent for a moment as a dice rolled inside it. Then it grew solid again and raised a short sword to meet the hammer bearing into it. The bandit pushed the elven man aside and swung at him. The demon's voice muttered in the background.
So they make a dexterity save by rolling a d20.
Then grew louder as the hooded figures looked at the curly-haired boy.
Roll a d20.
It rumbled. A 5. The elven man stumbled from the cut of the sword into his arm, then retaliated with a crushing swing to the bandit's side. They dropped instantly, moaning in pain. Meanwhile, the 2 bandits ran towards the sorcerer. One knocked an arrow and let it fly while the scrawny kid rolled his die. A 15! That's a miss! He cried excitedly. The other raised a spear. I cast burning hands on the 2 bandits, said the kid dramatically. The bandits briefly turned transparent as dice rolled, then grew solid. One dove out of the way, the other stumbled into the flames, roaring from the sorcerer, and fell to the ground, desperately rolling. The other raised his sword before getting tackled by Jolder. The girl rose from the brush silently, behind the remaining 2 bandits, who were frantically trying to knock arrows. They turned transparent as dice rolled, but didn't notice her as the 3 and 7 faded back into their bodies. Knives were whipped to their throats, and they froze.
"Look, listen, we didn't want to do this," one desperately said.
The other was nodding as frantically as he could without slitting his own throat.
"We need supplies. We need food. Our families are starving in this infernal winter."
The curly-haired elf straightened as the boy spoke.
Why do you have no supplies already?
The bandit shook his head.
"Our village was attacked. We had no other options. The people were terrified. Skeletons came to life as in stories, not real life."
The curly-haired boy's face grew taut for a moment, in unexpected emotion. The girl whispered loudly.
"Was it a necromancer with a skeletal army?"
The bandit swallowed carefully and nodded. The 3 kids looked at each other for a moment, while the hooded figures loomed above. The scrawny kid smiled and said, "Well, why don't we dish the necromancer some nice cold revenge for all those towns?" The scarlet eyes in the shadowed cowls gleamed eagerly, and the demon began speaking again.